All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. I'm excited to talk about how to use your requirements to build better software, better living through building better software through better requirements. So thank you for joining. It'll take probably I'll have about 45 minutes of presentation and then some time for questions here. Also, feel free to drop questions, comments, etc. in the chat at any point. The webinar chat is open for everyone. You can also use the Q&A feature, although honestly, I find the chat works better. Everybody can see the things you post in chat. Also, highly recommend using chat to heckle the webinar presenter, to crack your favorite dad jokes. We need more entertainment. I am not enough entertainment for a lunchtime webinar. So please do your best to make this better in the chat. Post those comments, post those questions, post those dad jokes, post the heckling. I'm here for all of it to keep that chat alive. In the meantime, hi, my name is Paul. Paul at Mack. I'm a senior product manager here at Integral. And I'm really excited to talk about requirements. I know that's a little bit of a dry and nerdy topic, and that sounds and feels a little weird to say. But I'm excited because I love working with our teams and stakeholders to build valuable software. It gets me really excited when we can see that our teams are winning. Everyone knows that they're winning because things make sense. It's really clear what we're building. And we can move faster, but also move with clarity and quality because our requirements are helping us drive towards the valuable software we want to build. And ultimately, for me, I get excited about these nerdy topics like requirements and our backlogs because it makes software development a little less confusing and painful, and hopefully a little or maybe even a lot more fun because we have space to have fun with it because of the ways that we've made it less confusing, easier, and less painful. So thank you for joining today. Get my thing to where I can click to the next slide. Yeah, so if I succeed in this daring webinar delivery feat, these are my goals for today. And I would welcome you as you're reading through these and as I'm talking about them. If you see something or you're hoping for something out of talking about requirements and using requirements to build better software, if there's something that isn't reflected here, please drop it in the chat. I want to know if there's questions or goals or hopes you have for this next hour, for 42 minutes, whatever we got, that aren't addressed here, so that I can make sure to keep that in mind and see what we can do to help address those. My goal is that you'll be able to recognize some anti-patterns that pop up, and you'll be able to see them as they creep up in your backlog. You may even have a few moments of like, oh yeah, that happens to me too, I hope, as we talk about some of those anti-patterns. By anti-pattern, what do I mean? A thing that happens, a pattern, but it's not desirable. It's an anti-pattern, not a good pattern, a desirable pattern. And they creep up, they're inevitable. So I want to share a couple of those that I've seen. And then ultimately, the big goal is to use those anti-patterns to help us see the pain points that we run into, and share a toolbox of the antidotes that I find work best for them. And the antidotes that I'm going to share today are focused on obviously writing better requirements. And that's note across all backlog levels. What I mean there is like your epics, your features, your stories, all of them can help you to deliver better software with better requirements. We'll talk specifically about ways to do that. Ultimately, with the key goal, the goal is not to become a novel writer. None of us are the next TJ Klune or Jane Eyre or whoever your favorite author is. We're not looking to write a novel or a nonfiction piece. We're looking to deliver high value software. So I'll talk a little bit about why I use these tools, not to be an amazing, beautiful, famous writer, but to deliver high value software and how they work that way for me. And the last thing I want to note that's a goal for me, one of the reasons that I find it matters a lot to focus on these kinds of anti-patterns and the antidote tools that I use is because there's a lot of different roles on a team. You've got business side folks like your product owner or a business representative of another kind of business analyst, et cetera, that are bringing you business needs. You've got product designers, you've got product managers like myself, you've got engineers, you may have architects, you may have other roles on your team. And so these tools that I'm going to share can help with creating clarity across all of those people. So let's jump in and get going on any of that. Again, if there's other things you want to see today, feel free to drop those in the chat. So I mean, the requirements, right? Like it's just, everyone's done this. We all have the tools we love to use. Like ultimately, it's just writing the story. Let's get it done fast and let's get the work done mostly. We don't want to spend so much time in planning. What could possibly go wrong? So I'll start by talking about a few of the things that I've seen go wrong. Okay? I call this first kind of anti-pattern reinventing the story, every story. I'll tell it a little bit as a story. So say I am a product manager working on a platform, and I've been using this format because I like it I want to. So So I've got the story that I wrote. I've got the sample UX for adding this price of everything and total number of everythings to the cart icon. And this is the story format I've been using. And then this new product manager joins and they start writing stories, and they really are super into this. In order to, we will. I'm actually going to pitch that later. So I'm mocking myself a little bit right now, but sure. New product manager joins. They've got this new way of doing it. Yay. And they start writing stories this way. And they also still throw the notes at the bottom like this. Cool. We've got two different story formats. No big deal, right? Like, it's not a problem. Well, then one of our engineering leads that helps manage the prod side runs into a prod problem. And they go back to using the old story format because that's what they'd seen the original product manager using in the first place. So they just quickly write a story, also as I want to. So that doesn't seem particularly valuable. They just need a Zendesk to get done for a prod issue that is linked to this story. So here we are. So now we've got that coming back in. And then my tech lead, being the incredibly thorough person that they are, gets an email from the security team. We need to do some things to change how we're storing our secrets because they're not done in compliance with the security team's rules for secure storage. They're incredibly thorough. So they use both formats. Since that's what they've seen the two product managers do, they decide to use both of them. And so the next story we see coming through has both the as I want to, so, in order to, and then the links to the things that are needed. And then our architect, they've got some tech debt they're trying to address because they've been doing a review of our database and have a bunch of fields that we need to remove. And the architect is less familiar with our backlog, and so they come in and grab this last story. They have no idea how to write the as I want to, so that part of it, or it seems useless to them. They use this in order to, we will, but they leave the part blank at the top. And then a bunch of notes of all the things that are what they really need to get work done. And I could keep going with more and more of how this kind of thing goes. What I've seen happen is that as we start with a way we do something, depending on the person that's writing the story within the team, depending on their context, depending on the content of the story itself, we're effectively reinventing the story every time, but we're sort of following the patterns that we've done in the past, and it gets really messy and confusing. And it's both messy and confusing for the person writing the story and for the person reading the story. As we take this to the team, they're getting a bunch of different formats of stories, some of which are all filled in, some of which are not. Some of the information that's filled in is actually useful and valuable. Some of it is not. And I've just started with this example of showing how this goes. If you do this, this is 4 or 5 stories here. If you do this for a few weeks, you can end up with a wild assortment of story formats that are partially filled in or all filled in, and the confusion just gets worse and worse. It starts to feel like whether you're reading a story or writing a story, this is what's happening is you're trying to get the information out of your brain about what you need from the team, or what the business requirement is, or what the desired outcome is. And as you're trying to read the story, you're trying to pick through all the threads of yarn to understand what's being asked of you and how to get it done. Another error pattern that I've seen, this is my other big one that gets me, is what I kind of call the AC, the acceptance criteria that will never die. So here's one example of it. These are those stories that give everyone hives as you try to point them or estimate them, because you know that you're not sure you could ever actually finish this story, or you're really nervous about what's going to happen as you play this story. So for example, maybe you've been asked to integrate an address search tool. You can see in the story there's an assumption made. Well, there's another team within our platform of products here that already did this. They've used this exact same tool. It's a lift and shift. We're just going to copy paste what they did, drop it into our product and our shipping thing the same way they did in their shipping thing. So this is easy, right? So there's a lot of assumptions baked in this that are going to make anyone that's done this before really nervous that we really know the scope of this story. Same time, I've written this kind of story, making that assumption, and it's easy and quick and fast to do because you're trying to get the work done and get the work to the team to do. Or maybe you've seen this AC that will never die. Seems innocent enough, right? Like, hey, the product designer gave us an InVision spec or a Zeppelin spec or a Figma spec or whatever your favorite is. So we just got it. Here it is. Here's the spec. I'm not a CSS or styling expert or any of that, but I can just give the spec to the team and say, hey, we need to go do some changes to make the styling match the new design system. Here's the new UX spec. I could even maybe throw side-by-side screenshots down here. But in my experience, this also makes the team break out in hives, because how pixel perfect does it need to be? Exactly which changes? And are we reading the spec right? Did the PD understand this about the current page? when they wrote the spec that way? Also, do any of these styling changes cause functional issues with their page? How do we address those, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? This can be a really terrifying story to play, even though it seems like a fast, easy, and innocent way to address something that the product designer brought to us that we need to do. Or maybe this story. DevOps released some new pipeline rules. They have a list of all the non-compliant logic. So we just need to go remove our non-compliant logic. Why can't we just point this and play this, right? Like, and also, I'm not a pipeline expert. I don't know. I could go spend hours reading through all this. It's not valuable. Maybe I throw it at my tech lead, but also they're constantly overwhelmed by all this kind of stuff. And now they've got to go dig through and write a bunch of things. So why don't we just play this story and have the team go look through the non-compliant logic and make the changes? I've been tempted to do this before. Save the tech lead a bunch of extra digging through all of this, save us a bunch of extra planning and scoping time. Just give this to the team to do. At the same time, everyone loves pipelines and everyone loves compliance. And this story tends to also get a lot of pushback from the team because it's unclear how they'll be able to close scope on it or how much work is even included in this story, depending on what the non-compliant logic actually is and what is in our code and not in our code about that non-compliant logic, and how it's used, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, now we've got like a 3-day research project or more just to even be able to get this story to the point where it could be played or split into multiple stories. And at the base of all of this is ultimately you've got different people looking at different problems and trying to make sense of them, right? And you're trying to write ACs, get the work done, minimize the amount of overhead that's spent in backlog defining and planning and all of that. But at the same time, minimize the amount of wasted work, the amount of confusion, the amount of rework or double work, et cetera. Like poorly written ACs can lead your team to do the wrong work or do confusing work, or have work that ultimately you can't close scope on because you don't even know exactly how to know that it's done. And the issue in some ways at the root is, are we even talking the same language, right? You may be, you want for us at least at Integral, our ideal situation is anyone can come into the backlog at any time and write a story. We don't want to have the bottleneck be the PM or the tech lead or the architect, whoever it is that's the story writer for the team, can quickly become the bottleneck. And besides that, they're often just playing telephone with the person that actually knows the needs of the thing, whether that's the person that's coming from the business side or the designer, the architect, the tech lead that's looking through the details of a compliance issue, or maybe an engineer on the team that happened to notice a risk or an issue, or discovered a new requirement or a new use case. So anyone on the team ideally could just write a story. That would be a lot faster. But are we even talking the same language? Each of these people is bringing a different point of view to the story or the feature or the epic that they're writing, and doing the best they can to ask for what they think they need in the language that they have. But ultimately, we're each coming at this with different language about the software we're trying to build. So that's where I look to some of these antidotes to help me solve some problems. We've all felt these kinds of pain as we're working to write software requirements. So what do you do? How could you have a better experience for everyone when people do start to find ways to speak the same language, to reduce the amount of overhead in your backlog and in writing and reading and pointing and estimating stories, making sure the team understands the work, but also getting to the goal of just getting the software built as fast as possible. So first, before I jump into the new content that I'm going to share in this webinar, I will give a quick pitch for backlog structure. One of the ways that I find speaking the same language, we get to speaking the same language and to having more efficient structures for doing that, is through having consistent, purposeful backlog structure. I gave an entire webinar on this topic in November. The link is here in YouTube for you to go watch. Highly recommend that if you have not, if you find that you're struggling with consistent and purposeful backlog structure. I won't obviously play the entire thing for you. I will just highlight the reasons I find this helpful is at a high level, having a clear way that you handle epics and features and stories, the buckets and the levels of your backlog, who's owning them, using a consistent structure. We'll talk about that here in a minute across all of them, and being purposeful about what epics and features and stories are for, the handoffs for each of them, et cetera, how workflow gates help you do that, et cetera. Each of these things that I talk about in that previous webinar will greatly help you to get on the same page and be speaking the same language across all levels of your organization as you're seeking to deliver software. What I want to do today, the new content that I want to add, is actually add some very nitty-gritty details about how you get inside the backlog in each card, each epic, each feature, each story, and write better requirements within those cards. So I'll let you go watch this entire backlog if this will be helpful to you in thinking about your overall backlog structure. And let's start talking about the tools that I find most useful inside the card, epic, feature, or story. So the first one is use a consistent template. Sounds a little obvious, but no one loves being the Gestapo of the backlog. No one loves being your story police, etc. At the same time, in my experience, it's worth it to aim for and really hold the standard on a consistent template because of the two big wins you get. It's way more efficient for your readers and your writers. Our brains work in patterns. And so as a reader, if I'm coming in and using the exact same structure every time, I'm going to write stories faster. I'm going to have a clearer time of going, oh yeah, is that clear about the story yet? Or is that scope closable? Is that where it needs to be for me to take to the team? If I'm using the exact same structure, I get fast at using that structure to get my requirements clear for the team. And it's consistent across all of the writers on our team that we're all using that structure and getting good at it. So our writers are now all speaking the same language using a template. At the same time, for readers, for the folks that are grooming the work, need to understand what we're trying to do here, review it and approve it, perhaps as like an architect or security or DevOps team, or actually do the work if you're an engineer on the team. It's also more efficient for them. They're used to seeing the stories in the exact same pattern. So it just gets a lot clearer and faster to understand the requirements you're writing when you use a template. What that results in is the win of like, you don't have to like, with every story, try to decide, is this good enough for the team? Is this good enough to get done? You at least can sort of go, is the template there? Did the template get followed the way we follow it? And so it helps make it easier to set the bar for what good requirements look like. I will say two pitfalls with using a consistent template, or if you have 0% flexibility, and kitchen sink templates. So if you just cannot in any way change anything about the template, it just gets clunky. There are going to be exceptions. There are going to be stories that don't fit. I've also seen people, in attempting to avoid 0% flexibility, just let their template bloat and bloat and bloat. They add a new section, they add a new thing every once in a while, trying to address every single potential story case. And the template just gets massive for their story. So let me give you an example of my favorite template and why I use it, that for me gets these two wins as best as I think I can get them, but also avoids some of the pitfalls. Before I jump to the specific template, I will also note, when I say use a consistent template, I mean every single part of your backlog. So the template you use for an epic should be the same as the template you use for a feature, should be the same you use as a template for a story. This matters because I want engineers that are playing a story to be able to go look at the feature for that and quickly get the same efficiency in understanding the feature that their story is a part of. You want an executive leader or someone who's over multiple products within a platform to be able to be working on an epic and jump down into the features of the stories and have the template make sense to them. You start to lose efficiency if you're using different templates across the levels of your backlog as well. So this is the template that I like best, both because I find it's very lean, while still getting me all of the things I absolutely need to give clear requirements. And it can be used effectively across epics, features, and stories, across all the different levels that we might want to define work at. So let's talk about why this is my standard template. First off, in terms of flexibility, the things that are non-negotiable for me at this point are these three parts. I don't want more, I don't want less, although I may sometimes delete the notes. We'll talk about that on the next slide. But I know that I at least need some kind of high-level way to describe the value we're trying to deliver, kind of the story itself. I know that I need acceptance criteria, some clear ways that this is what has to be done, this is how the story will be verified. And then I know that there's going to be things that we need to tell the team to give them context, to give them resources, et cetera, about how to play the story. For me, I've come to really like, as my standard usage for the value description part, the in order to, we will. You know, a lot of people are familiar with I want to, so that I showed earlier. The reason I've come to like the value description better is you can drop the persona into both or your in order to and we will. In either part, you can include talking about the persona or personas that you want to serve with this story. You can still include the personas that are important as part of the story. What I found with in order to I want or as a I want so format is that often it's a little confusing because sometimes multiple personas are covered in a story, or who the persona is isn't entirely clear because there's something broad going on. And so it can get a little awkward trying to use that format. And I like this one because it's simpler and covers all use cases more easily. I also like in order to, we will, because it puts the business value up front. The idea is this is what we're trying to deliver ultimately. The thing that is valuable about playing this feature, this story, is this win in order to, what the business is looking for here. And then there's the technical solution. It helps the team that's looking at this work and everyone else that's helping scope the work understand the core goal we're trying to accomplish, the in order to. And maybe even be able to offer better we wills. Maybe there's ways that we could change the technical solution to still meet that need. Or it creates clarity around why we have to use the technical solution we're using, even if there's concerns or risks in it or whatever. So that's my favorite value description, is the in order to we will, and I've come to use it for pretty much all of my stories. Given, when, then, while it can be a little bit wonky at times or a little difficult to write, has become my favorite acceptance criteria format. Mostly because I find that one of the reasons that some of the anti-patterns happen in the stories that we looked at before is I, as a person writing a story, have a lot of context on what I'm asking the team to do. I know that there's some given situation, some context that's happening. I know that there's some action that's going to trigger a thing. And then here's what I need to be true in that case. But it's really easy when you're just writing bullets of acceptance criteria or verification or whatever other way you share your acceptance criteria, to kind of skip sharing all of that knowledge with the team. And so by practicing writing the leanest, most concise given, when, then possible, I'm forcing myself to give the team the context, to give the team the action in the software, and then give, here's what I need to see happen with a list of clear, verifiable ACs. And so I find the given, when, then, well, it can be a little extra work to write these, is really helpful to be really clear on what the team needs to know about what we're asking of them. It typically, for me, in writing a good given, when, then means that the team is faster in grooming the story. The given and the when make it clearer for them to understand the ACs themselves of what needs to happen to verify this story. Lastly, I include just one note section to the greatest extent possible. Sure, you need to note the things that are out of scope and not part of this story, might be addressed in later stories, or that we're intentionally de-scoping from this story. You might need to note assumptions or risks and what we're going to do if any of those things happen, or the assumptions prove false, or the risks and dependencies don't play out the way we assumed they would, etc. We need to note that in the story itself or in the feature itself. And you need to include all the links to the resources, the technical guidance, the SMEs, subject matter experts for a topic, etc. I've seen people break this out into multiple sections. That's part of how you end up with a kitchen sink template with a section for everything. A lot of those sections end up blank or confusing. And so just having a single notes section where you know you need to include these kinds of things is what I found best. And then I add the ones that are relevant to the story. I'll even often add things in the notes section as we're grooming a story. So if the team asks a question, I'm like, oh, actually, that's out of scope for this story. Well, cool. I'll just quickly add a bullet to know what we just talked about in grooming that's out of scope. Same for assumptions or risks or dependencies, or like we need a SME for this topic. I'll even at times will add a note of like, so-and-so is going to go find the link and add it to this story for a resource. And then we block the story until that resource is linked in the story, but we can at least still point it today on the assumption that we'll get that link added. And all of that goes in one note section at the bottom, which keeps it lean. On the flexibility point, I will share within this consistent template that I've been using, a couple of things that I'll flex on. One, while I pretty much exclusively use in order to we will at this point, I do sometimes go back to the as a I want so that. For me, the situation that tends to most lead to that is where it's really important to call out the persona up front. Because obviously, if you look back, what you're giving in the in order to and we will has the other parts of the I want. And so that in it, it's just putting the business value at the front and describing the technical solution underneath that. thing that is different with this is that the persona is up top. So if there's a situation where I have a story, a thing that I'm trying to accomplish where centering the persona is incredibly important, I will then go back to using the as a I want so that format. Also just made me realize one other thing I like that's a kind of an artifact of using in order to we will is typically this we will is a great story title that everyone can understand. I'll show some examples of that later as we work through stories. So it makes it really easy to also title your stories something really understandable because you're describing exactly what we'll do, which makes a great story title. That's less true often in how you end up using as a I want so that. So I only use this if I really want to call out this persona. Next thing that I'll often flex on is, look, sometimes you really don't need the given when then. Now, the thing I'll say is that sometimes it's tempting to think you don't need the given when then, when really it's just hard or confusing to write your given when then. That's actually a sign that you need to do the work. You need to think through what is the context, what is the software action that's going to trigger this? How do you make sure that's clear to the team so that they understand what they're doing as they go to play the work? So if it's hard or confusing for me to write a given when then, that usually means I need to do the work to do it and not skip it because it's easier and faster. That's just going to result in confusion for the folks that are going to help me finish scoping this work, understand what we're trying to do and validate that it's the right thing to do, and for the folks actually doing the work. However, if I do write the given when then and I realize it's just redundant or it's a bunch of extra unhelpful text, it's pretty obvious the given and the when part. This is just a do the things. In that case, sometimes I will delete the given and the when because they just feel like distractions and unhelpful. They're there, they're written, but they're not actually helpful to the team. And instead, I'll just include the bulleted list of ACs and make sure they're 100% clear and verifiable. Again, that tends to be an exception for me where I really find that it's worth deleting the given and when and just including the bullets, but it is sometimes the case where it makes for a leaner, cleaner story. And finally, the other thing I'll flex on is just deleting the notes section. Like, look, if you have nothing there, don't leave it there. You don't have to leave a bunch of blanks in your template just to show that you followed the template. So just delete it. As you saw in some of the examples I was showing, the cleaner the story, the faster and easier it is to read. And so I'll delete the stuff that I'm not using in the notes and get rid of that section entirely if there's nothing. So the other thing that I think is incredibly important, and I said story here in the title, this could also be epic or feature. One of the rules that I work really hard to have teams be able to hold, and I think is incredibly powerful and important, is that no work gets pointed without a definition of done and a definition of ready. So the boundary we want the team to be able to hold is if these things aren't true in a feature or a story, the work's not ready and we're not ready to estimate it. We can't commit to when we're going to have it done because the scope is not clear and is not closed and we're not confident what it's going to look like to get the work done. And whoever's responsible for that epic feature or story needs to go back and make sure that they actually do get these things in place within the story template that we're using. What do I mean by definition of done and definition of ready? Why are these boundaries that we hold? So definition of done, painting a clear picture of what's going to result in delight from the folks that are going to use this. Yay, please, I love using this, woohoo. What's going to get that for us? And that picture should be clear in the story to everyone involved. So often sometimes you can actually have real user feedback that tells you that leads to how you write a feature or a story. Sometimes it's market research that's the evidence for how you're going to delight users and why you know this is valuable to do. Sometimes it's also a proxy, like your product designer or your product owner, or sometimes the product manager can proxy for, yes, this is clearly what done will look like, and we're confident that this will be valuable and delightful to users, but that picture of done needs to be clear and verifiable in the story written. Everyone needs to have confidence that you will reach a delightful result and you'll know when you've gotten there when you're done. On the flip, people talk about a definition of ready. The way I've come to think about a definition of ready is actually more about the team. The story is ready if, and I say software engineers here, it could be anyone that's going to do the work itself. So for me as a product manager, I'm often getting handed epics or features that I need to break down into playable work for the team. And I want to also be able to look at the folks handing me work and go, hey, like this isn't ready. The feature, the epic doesn't have enough for us to get this to a point where we'd have a clear definition of done and can play it. And the definition of ready that I use that helps me with holding that standard is that whoever has to do the work can say, yeah, this makes sense to me. I have some idea of how we build it, and I'm confident that I can prove it to you when I'm done. These are really important boundaries to hold in your ceremonies, whether that's release planning, when you're taking in a quarter's worth of work and looking at all the features, or every week during your sprint planning or iteration planning meeting, backlog grooming, whatever you call it, or the team is reviewing the work and pointing it, estimating it, et cetera, to be able to turn back work and say, I mean, we could get going on this, but it's not actually ready for us to commit to yet, is really important. At the same time, what if I can't do all this? We've all been in this boat where, look, you've got timeline pressure. You need to get results. You need to get the software built, and all this stuff that Paul says about consistent templates and getting it clearly written and definition of ready and definition of done and the team being able to reject work. But sometimes it just grinds the system to a halt. It's incredibly stressful and exhausting as a person attempting to write the stories, write the features, and get the work to the team to get done. Seems really basic and easy to say, but in practice, it can result in ending up feeling like the person in this picture, right? And so often it can seem easier to just push work down on the teams or throw it over the wall to someone else to get done. You're just trying to get to the result. And it can feel like all of this is really just a blocker to getting results because you're attempting to write that novel. Or it's just really difficult to do this on some of the work that you need to get done. Or the team can get in a position where they just get exhausted of holding this standard and holding the boundary of rejecting work that they're not confident has a clear picture of done, or is clearly ready. And so you can end up feeling like you're in constant fire drills for getting the work done that you've committed, that somebody committed you to, or you're chasing getting enough work to fill your backlog, because everything's getting blocked in the discovery and defining stage before the work really gets to the team doing it. So for me, the next thing I think of is then is like, cool, yeah, this is great to talk about doing this. How do you keep the team engaged and excited to hold these standards and also keep your features and your stories flowing when it is really often difficult to set a scope for something that can be done in a feature that takes a few weeks or a story that takes a few days. And that is where I look at a couple more tools that I'll share here for what I think of as lean story writing. So there's three tools that I'll share that I like to use in writing leaner stories. And I'll actually go back to the examples that I shared at the beginning for how I use these tools to make these stories more playable while still keeping the team moving and while avoiding kind of the more waterfall world where we have to do a multi-day planning effort with a bunch of people in a meeting or they pushing things back and forth async between a bunch of folks that need to input. So the first leaner tool that I use is research spikes. Thank you to Nintendo Spike for making this fun for me to present. I've heard a lot of people call these kinds of stories, any of these kinds of stories that aren't actually development or coding, deliverable coding work, a spike. So the DevOps story that I shared at the beginning about pipeline compliance is a great example of where I might use a research spike. Like, look, I got this email from our compliance folks. I'm not a DevOps expert. Maybe one person on our team is. Heck, that means we need other people on our team to start learning more about our pipelines and what it looks like to be compliant with these new rules. But rather than me having to become the bottleneck or our tech lead or that one person that worked in Tecton that one time, whoever it is on the team, why not write a story, a research story? We can time box it or we can point it. I've done both with these kinds of spikes. Leave that up to the team about what they think makes sense as far as a time box versus actually just pointing, getting this done. But notice the change. The goal here is not just get it all done, whatever. We just need to do it. So we just have to be compliant. Let's do it. It's saying, hey, let's take the time to play a story where someone's going to go and their outcome is to write draft stories. They need to go look at our logic, look at the new rules, and then draft the stories. And then they're going to bring those back to me. And then I can hopefully pretty quickly get those grouped into lean stories that can be delivered, decide with our PO how to prioritize those based on the whatever mandates we have from the DevOps team about how long we can take to do this, or where it sits next to the rest of our work. And so now instead of a AC that will never die with trying to just finish all this compliance work, we have a set of stories with a clearly understood scope that this pair brings back to the rest of the team after they play this research spike. And we can review those stories with the entire team, make sure it makes sense to everybody. And then the PO is able to prioritize them alongside all the rest of the work with a lot more clarity on the scope of the story. Another kind of thing I've heard people call this kind of thing a spike as well, is a technical design story, a technical design spike. So this shipping address example is a really great place where I might do what I'd call leaning out, making more the delivery, the implementation approach more lean for something like adding a shipping address. And this might still ultimately go in its entire own feature for shipping address. But the first thing I want to do is, instead of me getting together with a bunch of folks or whatever and trying to plan this out, because the team rejected the story because it's an unplayable story, too big, too much unknowns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is go, oh, well, why don't I just hand that back to the team? So we've got this story that we wrote here that's clearly unplayable, but if we give it a little spin and do a technical design spike lean cleanup on it, I can do a similar thing to what I just did. I know enough to hand this off to the team. But what I need is a clearer, because the team told me this does not hit the definition of ready, definition of done. It can't be clearly pointed or done within the 1 to 5 day window that we aim to for. It's got a lot of risk, a lot of unknowns in it. So what I really need is to get those risks and unknowns into a design, an approach for how we'll implement this address search tool. And so for me, that involves typically something like this, where I clearly scope and in this case, notice a couple of deliverables, not just the stories and the compliance thing. That's pretty clear. That's like, we just need to probably write the stories for becoming compliant with those pipeline rules. But here, I want the team to actually go do some technical design work. They're going to update our checkout architectural diagram for this shipping address function. I like to call it Franken UX rather than wireframes, because that's more fun, right? You take the existing website, you screenshot it, you do a bunch of copy pasting things or markup on it to indicate what it's supposed to look like. And that's good enough probably for editing an existing page, or to send over to your PDs to say, hey, here's what we think we need. This is our Franken UX of the changes we're going to make to shipping address. Can you get us a real spec for this if we really think it needs that much design work? So I'll actually ask the engineers to go ahead and get copy pasting in Miro or Figma or whatever tool we're using and create a Franken UX as part of this story alongside the diagramming updates. And in order to do that, they can go talk to the commercial ecom team. They can go look at the commercial ecom team's page and code base under that, read through the tool documentation, get that design in place, and at least stub out some stories of how they think we should build it. At that point, this story comes back to me with the feature for building this effectively. Maybe it's 2 stories, maybe it's 7. I don't know. We'll find that out when the team plays this story. Draft it out. And so now, instead of me being the bottleneck or our tech lead or whomever else has to go chase this down, the team is empowered to unblock themselves and scope the work, or at least draft the scoping of the work for themselves. And then in both of these examples, I don't ask them to do the extra work of the writing of the stories. Notice both of those. Sure, hand it back to the PM. They're the expert in using our template to get this written and deciding if this deserves its own feature or if it can just stay in it. So sure, hand it back to the PM. Let them take the stubs that you've written and actually get this written into stories. But we end up a lot leaner, a lot faster, and a lot more efficient at delivering these kinds of things than if we had to do a massive planning effort to have this all scoped without doing it this way. Last example I'll share is from the beginning, this monster of a story. No software engineer wants to go fight the styling dragon. But at the same time, no product designer wants to have to give you a bullet pointed list of every single pixel perfect change they are and are not expecting. They gave you a spec that's there in all the things in the Figma or whatever. So why do they have to go make that list? And you can spend a lot of time as a product manager or a tech lead or an architect trying to chase all this down and get it to the point where someone's not terrified to fight the dragon. And so for me, I get tired of doing that and hate making all those lists or asking other people to. And so my favorite thing to do with this is what I call the time box dragon. It's not nearly so scary to the team if I say, look, we've got a spec. I get it that we've got an existing page. I get it that there's a lot of unknown. And I get it that no one wants to be held accountable to making this pixel perfect with sort of a, I don't know exactly what they are and aren't saying in the Figma sometimes or whatever. So how about we just time box it? I know that in let's figure out the number of days, whether that's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever. How many days do we really need to go in and at least take a first pass at it that we think gets us 80% plus of the way there? So now no one's going to be terrified that they're going to be facing this never ending story of frustration where they keep doing all these changes. No one's going to have to face trying to make the list of every single spec change that needs to be made. Instead, we can say, cool, thanks for the new spec. We'll come back to you in 2 days, 3 days, whatever. We can block time on the product designer's calendar even and say, here's the changes. Let's take a look at your spec side by side with the story. Also, maybe we run into some functional problems with the design. Let's talk through those. And so the result is in a few days of doing as much as we can to get to this new UX spec that we've been given, we either find, yep, we're done and everyone's happy and we're good, and a good thing we didn't spend a bunch more time planning that, or now we know exactly what we do need to write stories for to address some sticky things that we found as we started to implement, to just run through a punch list of pixel perfect changes, etc. And so we've time boxed the dragon to the point where we know that the outcome might be writing some additional stories, but instead of trying to predict up front exactly how to do all the work perfectly, we just spent a certain specified number, time box number of days up front getting it done. So those are the tools and tricks I have to share with you that I've been finding help me write better requirements, get to the working software faster. Curious what y'all have.